Hey, thanks for joining me tonight. Wednesday nights, we were doing kind of a question and answers series, just taking different questions from the youth here at Westgate. Tonight's question has to do with friendship, and this was brought up because of in 2 Samuel, David and Jonathan's relationship and how it is really obscure. It's like the only friendship we see like that in Scripture between two people of the same sex. That seems to be that intimate, and it weirds a lot of us out. A lot of us don't know how to respond to it, especially for those of us who hold to a biblical Christian sexual ethic, as Jesus talks about it, as the Old Testament talks about it, where homosexuality would be considered a sin. So how do we come to terms like that, or how do we make that make sense with a story like David and Jonathan? So I'm going to try to tackle that tonight. And how I want to do that is it's really hard for us to just go back to Old Testament times and look at the cultural situation and say, okay, what were friendships like back then? Really because there's just not a lot of data there. Some things are really evident, but we just don't have like these treaties on what friendship is supposed to be. That doesn't come around until like Aristotle. So Aristotle is the first one to kind of write this long dissertation kind of thing on what friendship is. And since he's the first one, anyone over the next several centuries always refer to his work and base things off of his book, which I think is called On Friendship. But even people like Thomas Aquinas, who is this top-notch theologian, 4th century, he even takes from Aristotle's point of view. But I don't really want to take it from Aristotle's point of view because I don't think that's really what we want to talk about. And now I could just go to like biblical data strictly, and we could just talk about friendship out of there. The only issue with that is that anytime the Bible really brings up friendship, it's talking about God's friendship to his people, to his creatures, like Abraham or Moses, or it's talking about Jesus' friendship with people. And while it's great, that really only gives us like a creator-creature type relationship. And then beyond that, the only types of relationships we see are really between brothers and sisters or family members. So like Moses and Aaron, super close, but they're brothers. Naomi and Ruth may be the second best, example to look at as far as what friendship means and what friendship should look like. I think that may be one of the main reasons Ruth is included in the story of the Old Testament. Number one reason she's included is because she is of the lineage of David, and it kind of shows more of his roots and Jesus' lineage as well, and shows who he has been related to or is related to, and how that's significant, considering Ruth's Moabite background. But I think another reason that Ruth is included is because it really does exemplify a good relationship between two people. Because Ruth was written in the time of Judges, and in the time of Judges, Israel's history was rough. People were murderers and idolaters, and it was really just grotesque period in Israel's history. But Ruth is like that one shining light during that time because of the type of love that she has for Naomi. And so biblical scholars will always refer to their type of love because it was a chesed type of love. And I think I'm pronouncing that right. It's a Hebrew word for love, and it's like this attaching oneself to another person. It's really deep. It's got a lot of theological significance behind it. God uses it several times to talk about his love. It's a very powerful type of love. And so Naomi and Ruth really do look like our second best example of what relationship looks like. Because there's big significance there in that Ruth has family that she could go and live with after her husband dies, but instead she joins herself to her mother-in-law and decides to live life with her mother-in-law versus her family. There was no obligation for her to do that. She simply did that out of love, out of this willingness to join herself to another person. That's what friendship, I think, would really look like. David and Jonathan have a very similar situation where Jonathan is at minimum 30 years older than David and joins himself to David and ends up being David's, number one companion. David goes on to say that Jonathan's love was greater than the love of a woman, which, if he's referring to Michal was awful to David. So that actually makes complete sense in context. But as a general kind of proverbial statement, what is David trying to say there? So that's what we do if we look at the biblical evidence or biblical examples of friendship. We're limited in what we can look at. So I think maybe an interesting thing to do would, if we can't go all the way back, 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, to look at these examples of relationships like David and Jonathan, we'll go back as far as we can to look at real examples of friendship. And maybe at least we can mark the differences between what we consider friendship now and what friendship has meant in even the not so recent past. So first, let me kind of give a theological foundation to what, and maybe even a philosophical foundation to what friendship is, and some of this comes from C.S. Lewis as well. Friendship is not necessary. Okay? If we're going to look at things that are necessary in this life, friendship is actually not one of them. And that might seem extreme or radical, and I'm not trying to say anything to grab attention. I think I'm actually stating some truth here. Friendship, having tight, close friends, is actually not necessary in the sense that you do not have to have friends that are so extremely close in order for you to get to heaven, in order for you to please God, in order for you to do things that will eventually grant you salvation. Okay, salvation has been brought to you by God. You fall into that grace and you abide by that grace by being obedient to God. And none of that really relates to you having intimate relationships with other people. So in that sense, friendship is not necessary. Some people really struggle, especially in our generation, my generation, and the generation coming up behind me. We really struggle with friendships. And we stress over it. We have anxiety over it. We cry about it. And so maybe this can ease our minds a little bit in that God is still pleased in you. God still loves you, even though you can't find these intimate relationships with other people. My salvation does not depend on friendships so much as my salvation depends on selfless love for my church family and my community. So regardless if I have people responding to my love or not, and me entering into intimate relationships with other people, as long as I am living selflessly for other people, God finds pleasure in me. God loves me. God is my friend. That is my ultimate relationship. That is the relationship I will gain strength and comfort from. So friendship is rather, while that is not necessary, rather it is someone to do something with. And that might just seem really plain and boring, but this is what I mean by that, and this is what I think C.S. Lewis confirms as well. If we are not about anything, friendships will be really difficult to come by and almost impossible to attain. Friendships are not, people in general, are not things for you to obtain. It's not like a car. It's not like a hat. They are personalities. They're difficult to work with. They have different motives than you do. If you and another person do not have the same goals in mind, do not have the same desires in life, it's difficult to join yourself to that person. And even if somehow you are joined to that person, it's going to be difficult to maintain that friendship. That's why a lot of friendships fail, is because me and that friend do not have the same goals, the same desires. And that's what happens when friends drift apart. C.S. Lewis, I like the way that he frames it in his book, Four Loves. He says, friendship must be about something, even if it were only an enthusiasm for dominoes or white mice, arbitrary things. Those who have nothing can share nothing. Those who are going nowhere can have no fellow travelers. And so that's a much more poetic way of what I was just saying. If you and a friend do not have the same goal, the same end point you're working towards. That is how friendships are cultivated, and that's how friendships stay strong. That's why it's really important for us to seek out friendships within the church, because it's those people within the church, while they may not be who you would picture yourself becoming best friends with, those are the ones you're ultimately going to have the strongest relationship to, is because you have the same goals in mind. And like I referred to earlier, this is why a lot of friendships don't work out. This is why we drift apart from friends. I've had this happen more times than I can count. It can be, it can't strictly be because we're not able to maintain these friendships because of distance. Okay, I've moved around a little bit the past 10 years, and so I haven't really been in one place an extremely long time. And I'll make friendships in these places, but then I end up moving. And I'll lose a lot of those relationships I had in those past areas. And some of that's distance. I have noticed, though, the relationships that I end up losing are with the people who I no longer have the same goals as. So, for instance, in college, I met a lot of people. But a lot of those people, even though I was at a Christian college, did not have God as their primary source of life and purpose. And because of that, we drifted apart. And that doesn't say anything about me. That's not saying I'm a perfect person, I have everything worked out. But that is my goal. That is what I'm working towards. And I found out that the people that I've been able to stay closest to are the ones who have devoted their life to ministry as well. Are those people who cry and sweat, have anxiety, fall into depression because of the struggles of ministry. Those are the type of people that I've ended up staying closest to, because we have that in common. We're working towards the same thing. That might be the reason, if you struggle with friendships, why some of your friendships haven't worked out in the past. Either you both had no goals, no endpoints you're working towards, nothing to kind of have this commonality in, or you had different goals, different endpoints you were working towards, and that causes friendships to burn out, to fade out, whatever. That's why we don't keep a lot of the same friends we had in high school. In high school, it's the same goal, to make it through high school, to get to graduation. Once you both get to graduation, what's the next thing that's keeping you together? It's no longer graduation. It's no longer high school. So how are you going to keep those friendships? That's maybe some of the ways that we look at or the reasons why friendships fade in and out. I would like to propose that there are three maybe primary reasons why friendship now is so different than what friendship used to be. And I know I haven't touched that yet because I think it's really good. I want to look at that last. But three reasons why I think our friendships aren't working out right now is we all want friends, but we don't know how to pursue it. We don't know what friendship is really supposed to look like. And what really falls, maybe even a side point under that one, if not a whole point in its own, is that we have real misconceptions about friendship, love, and sex that have inhibited our ability to even conceptualize what friendship would look like, should look like. And third, we are more mobile than ever with a strong commitment to autonomy. And I'm going to address all three of those points here in a second. But let's draw out, I'm going to talk about those 3 points as we talk about some ways that friendship has looked like in the past. In a review of a book called Spiritual Friendship, a personal hero of mine, Peter Lightheart, says this about friendship. Medieval monks expressed their love for one another with what to us is cringe-inducing intimacy. And not as long ago, Christians still entered formal bonds of friendship by taking vows that sounded like marriage vows. We don't do that anymore. With our commitment to uncommitted freedom, our turnover habits, our sexualization of everything and everyone, and our registration to loneliness. So there, Lightheart gives some reasons why he doesn't think friendships can be as intimate as the kind of friendship we see with David and Jonathan. I don't think David and Jonathan was a homosexual relationship at all. I think it was two men who were very comfortable in their sexuality, who loved each other deeply. We're often thrown off by the fact that they kissed. Well, if you remember, it wasn't but 2,000 years ago, Paul's writing the book of Romans, and he ends it with, hey, greet one another with a holy kiss. We think that's really weird, and surely he didn't mean an actual kiss. No, he really did. That's how people regularly greeted one another. Now imagine if you really loved someone and you were saying bye to them and you knew it was the last time you were going to see them. You would kiss them. You would hug them and kiss them and show your love for them. And it wouldn't have been anything sexual. There would have been no sexual attraction to that person being displayed. It was coming from a place of pure love, of godly love for that person. And I think that's what's happening here. But Lightheart says we can't read the David and Jonathan story without sexualizing it. And that's our fault. Let's go ahead and talk about this. So Benjamin Myers, he's written several books, but nothing specifically on this topic. Otherwise, I would reference it. But he has had some personal correspondence with people that he's put out, as well as some journal articles, I believe. He's an Australian theologian, and he actually blames Freud for a lot of our issues, because Freud had this suspicion that all relationships at base involve eroticism, involve some sort of sexuality. So he believed, you as a man, I would sexualize thoughts of my mother. If I was a daughter, I would sexualize thoughts of my father, and then I would choose partners based on who my father or mother was. We actually talk about that in modern times. You say, oh, you're always going to marry someone like your mom, or you're always going to marry someone like your dad. Those kind of thoughts come from Freud. Freud was a really disgusting guy. He over-sexualized everything. And Benjamin Myers is saying that's the reason we think of relationships the way we do now, is because the Enlightenment that happened in the 19th and 20th century actually caused a lot more damage than it helped things. One of those things is our over-sexualization. So we can't see two men showing affection for one another and not say that it's gay, or not say that they are homosexual. I had the opportunity to go to Africa for 2 weeks, and I spent 2 weeks in Arusha, Tanzania, and it was a really cool experience. But one thing that throws you off if you're not ready for it is that if two men are really good friends, they will walk down the road with one another, holding one another's pinkies. And if you and I were to see that out at a shopping center or out in the town, we'd say, oh, that must be a homosexual couple. That's not the case in Arusha, Tanzania, and most of Africa. As a man, if you have another friend who you love, who you're comfortable with, and you would walk down the street holding one another's pinkies. That's just modern time cultural differences. We have to take our Western eyes off, pluck our Western eyes out, and try to see things from other people's perspective. We have to stop putting our beliefs and our cultural ideas onto other cultures and other people's ways of living. I think Benjamin Myers has a point, that Freud has kind of damaged the way that we see people and see things. Your love for someone does not have to be a sexual love. This is actually what I talk about with brothers and sisters who deal with homosexual thoughts and feelings, is really consider the way you feel and don't try to over-sexualize it. You can love someone. You can show affection for someone and not sexualize it, not turn it into something it's not. It's okay to care about people of the same sex. It's okay to hug them. It's okay to show affection for them. But we tend to over-sexualize everything. This David and Jonathan relationship was not sexual. It was a way to express intimacy. Going back to Peter Lightheart's point that early on in Christianity, friendship looked much different than it did in other parts of the world. In medieval times, the closest relationships between Christians were actually it looked a lot different than other cultures in medieval times. What friendship looked like for them. Christianity turned friendship on its head when Christianity in medieval times began this practice called, let me try to get this word right, adelpho poiesis. and it means making brothers. And it was this vow that you took, and it almost looked like a wedding ceremony, where two men, most commonly, it could happen between two women as well, but two men would stand in front of a church, would make vows to one another, would kiss one another, would then take the Lord's Supper together, and then an officiant or a priest would read Psalm 133, verse 1, saying, "How good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity." That sounds a lot like a wedding ceremony, doesn't it? But it wasn't. It was to show commitment to another person. Friendship was taken very seriously then, in that you would make a lifelong commitment to another person, to never leave them or forsake them. There was a popular article written for a popular news publication where a girl wrote about how difficult it was to see her best friend say her wedding vows to her husband. Because in those wedding vows, even though she had known the bride for 20 plus years, the bride told the husband in her vows that he was the greatest friend she had ever had, that he knew her better than anyone else, when they'd only been together a little over a year. It really hurt the bridesmaids' feelings about the situation, perception about the friendship, because all of a sudden that marriage relationship took precedent over the friendship. In medieval times, even back into the first century, that's not how people viewed things. The relationship between men and the relationship between women were oftentimes much closer and even more significant than a relationship between a husband and wife. And when we look at that, a scripture like Ephesians chapter 5 makes a lot of sense, where Paul needs to kind of dictate what a husband and wife relationship should look like. In our modern culture, husband and wife relationship is at the top. Those are the people who should be the closest. And I think that's biblical. But that's not the way it's always been seen. Another example is back in 1684. Thomas Baines and John Finch were both buried together. They were not in a homosexual relationship. They were actually both heterosexual men who had wives and families. But they wanted to be buried together because they wanted, and it's actually inscribed on their casket, I believe. I don't know if they were buried in a casket. Anyway, inscribed and wherever they were buried is that they wanted that person to be the first one they see at the resurrection. That's how close of friends they were. They decided to make that kind of odd commitment to one another. And again, not homosexual. They were openly heterosexual, had wives, had families, but had this love for someone of the same sex. That was not sexual. That was not inappropriate in a biblical sense. That's something that's completely lost on you and I. And so that maybe that kind of talks about our misconceptions of friendship and love and sex. But what about this fact that we're more mobile than we ever have, and we have this commitment to autonomy? America, probably more than anyone else, we love our freedom. We die for our freedom. We do not joke about our freedom. We will not allow someone to take away our freedoms. Freedom, in a sense, has become a myth in that, and I mean myth in what myth truly means, is that we use it to describe something we don't completely understand. So we use freedom to talk about our purpose and freedom to talk about our desire, because a lot of times we can't figure out what our desires are, so we just label it as freedom. I want freedom. I want to be on my own. I want to be my own person. I want to be in charge, when that's truly not what's going to fulfill us. But anyway, freedom has become a myth as well. The less I am tied down to other people, the more open I am to discover who I truly am, the happier I will be. This is the reason a lot of people don't marry anymore. Oh, I don't want to put the marriage title on it. That'll destroy our happiness. We would rather just cohabitate with one another. We'd rather just say we're together but not be married, not bring the law into it. However it's phrased, I've heard it talked about in several different ways. That's how we talk about marriage. Well, we have that same perception on not being tied down to a person in marriage as we do about our friendships. We are truly not willing to commit to other people, in that we will lay down our desires, we will lay down our commitments for the sake of another person, to put them first, to have their interests before ours. Our freedom comes above friendship now, and that's why a lot of friendships don't work out. Jonathan exemplifies this. He was the next in line to become king. But when God ordained, anointed David for the role of king, Jonathan put aside his desires. No doubt he had aspirations to be king. He was a great military leader as well. But he put aside his desires and helped David secure the throne. He didn't put freedom above friendship. Friendship was number one from him. And that first point I brought up is that we all want friends, but we don't know how to pursue it. C.S. Lewis defends friendship in his book, Four Loves. And in one part, he kind of attacks arguments by people who accuse people of the same sex being close as being homosexual. And so he's trying to defend friendship. In a sense, he's saying, hey, two people of the same sex can be close. They can show affection for one another and it not be sexualized, and it not mean that they are in a sexual relationship with one another. And he says, he talks about this argument by saying, it's like trying to argue that there's an invisible cat in the chair. By you questioning the assertion, is there really an invisible cat in the chair, without any lack of proof, it may be marshaled in as proof. Does that make any sense? I hope that makes sense. It's like if I'm trying to argue with you, hey, there's an invisible cat in this chair, and you say, what do you mean? Is there really an invisible cat in this chair? No way there's an invisible cat in that chair. Well, then if I respond to you, prove that there's not an invisible cat in that chair. How do you do that? It's the same thing when two people of the same sex are in a close, intimate relationship with one another. Someone will say, "Oh, I bet they're gay. I bet they're in a homosexual relationship." You can't come back and say, "Well, no, I'm not," because they're going to say, "What? Okay, then prove it." Because look, you're being affectionate, you're close, you're spending all this time together, and so we have again sexualized relationships when there's no need for it. Sadly, I think we're almost too deep into this. I don't know how as a church we could destigmatize relationships like that, because I think friendship is most important for celibate gay Christians. And this is really the people I want to speak to right now is my brothers and sisters who struggle with homosexuality, who see themselves as, oh, I'm never going to be able to have an intimate relationship like a husband and wife. My prayer for you is that you can find a Jonathan to your David, someone who you can truly have a deep, intimate relationship with. I call on our churches to be that for those people, for people who choose singleness, not because it's their only option, but because, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, it's like the highest sexual choice you can make, to choose singleness in order to serve God. There are plenty of Christians out there right now living this out day to day. Plenty of people that I have met that live out this Christian sexual ethic of being a celibate gay Christian. It's possible. It's doable, and it's pleasing to God. And I want to let you know that you have people like me and so many other people in the church that are rooting for you, that are praying for you, that want to help you and assist you and be your friend and be your advocate, be there with you to stand and speak for you in any way we can. The church has a place for people who have homosexual thoughts and temptations. We do not exclude you, but we're calling all of us to maintain a healthy Christian, biblical sexual ethic. And I think relationships like David and Jonathan help us bolster that argument that yes, you can have fulfillment in human relationships here on earth. And we're all living out this Christian biblical sexual ethic for God, for pleasing God, and being the community and the people of God that He's called us to be. So hopefully this sheds a little bit of light on friendships, what friendships should be, what they could be, and how we have really moved away from what real friendship could look like. So hopefully this maybe demystified some things and is going to give you some things to look into and study on your own. Hope you're finding ways to love and serve your neighbor. Peace and love.